Ukraine invasion and its impact on markets is in focus today. Stocks, bonds, the US dollar, commodities all down overnight. There's been a flurry of diplomatic efforts to try and stop the war, and that is also having an impact on the price of oil. Oil prices have been falling, continuing a downward trend that we saw last week. Oil prices fell below 100 US dollars a barrel as negotiations between the Ukraine and Russia appear to grow more substantive. A risk to demand have also emerged with a resurgence of COVID lockdown measures in China, the world's largest importer of oil. Today, we dive deeper into what's driving the near-term oil markets and ask if the price of oil is much more sensitive to sentiment than actual supply and demand calculations. My guest today is Professor Ilian Mihov, Dean from INSEAD. Good morning, Ilian.
Hey, good morning, Michelle.
Okay, we can hear you loud and clear. That's a relief. Now,
Good.
oil investors are closely tracking oil prices, which have slid backwards to 100 US dollars a barrel, well off their highs of $130 last week. I wonder if you have an opinion behind what's causing this. Why have oil prices eased up even as the war in Ukraine continues?
Well, I think that there is a commitment to increase production in some of the oil-producing countries, because there is, as you mentioned, there is definitely a sentiment in these price fluctuations. But probably the most important variable that matters are the expectations of future supply and demand. And when there was no clarity whether supply will increase, oil prices shoot up, and then today we have more and more certainty that there'll be an increase. It will take time, so it's not about tomorrow. It's about 6 months from now, 1 year from now, that you'll see more oil flowing in. And also, of course, there were some positive signs that there might be talks in Ukraine to resolve the war, the conflict there.
Even though oil prices are sliding back, they are still significantly higher than where they were just a month ago. So, speaking of big picture, 7 days ago, though, President Joe Biden, US president, announced that the US will ban imports of oil from Russia, along with refined petroleum products, natural gas, coal. It's just the latest US action designed to punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And the EU says it could wean itself off Russian gas within years and start curbing its reliance on natural gas from Russia within months. EU states reportedly set to adopt new sanctions against Russia's oil majors, Rosneft, Transneft, and Gazprom Neft, but will continue to buy oil from them. So we'd like to get your thoughts. What do you think are the implications of the US ban and Europe committing to cutting imports in terms of its natural gas markets?
Yeah, well, I mean, the U.S., as people have commented many times by now, it uses very little oil from Russia, so that's not their major market. So for them, it's not such a big. I mean, it affects it, but it's not a big deal. For Europeans, it's a very big deal. So it will take time before they find alternative sources of gas. They start buying liquefied natural gas, and all these alternative ways of heating up during the winter and fueling their power stations. So that will take some time. For the U.S., they can go back to the shale cracking, to some of the reserves. And again, we expect also the increase in the Middle East in oil production that will help definitely.
Now, this week, the Federal Reserve is likely to raise interest rates for the first time since 2018, potentially strengthening the dollar, but also adding pressure to oil prices. So, in terms of what we can expect in terms of monetary tightening, what are your expectations on tightening monetary outlook amidst the ratcheting geopolitical uncertainty?
Well, it is. Yeah, it is true that the Fed is expected to raise interest rates. I think that the consensus now is 25 basis points. Everybody believes that. I think that this is too little. I know that there is a lot of uncertainty regarding growth, but at this point in time, inflation is a much bigger issue. And I think that they're just losing control of inflation. With now inflation before the war in Ukraine, running at 8%. And what actually worries me more is not 8%, it's that it's accelerating, that every month we get a higher number. And now everybody talks about the wage inflation and pressures on the labor market. So I was hoping that they'll do 50 basis points, but I feel that the consensus at 25 will probably be the right one.
Surging energy costs likely to add to inflationary pressures for the global economy. What are your expectations in terms of oil prices, where oil prices can go?
Uh, I think that nobody can make this prediction. I think that's something that I have seen in the past. Big investment banks with the research departments of hundreds of people making predictions that were completely off, in terms of like oil price will go over 200 in
Hmm.
2007 and
Now
so
it's about
on. So
150, some say. Yeah.
yeah, so it is very difficult to predict oil prices because again, what matters is not
Hmm.
just supply and demand. It's
Hmm.
also what matters are the expectations, and expectations of deliveries or basically supply. 10 10 months from now, 12 months from now can generate big changes in oil prices. So my sense is that if the war continues, like everybody else, I will believe that prices will increase. Now, to what extent production will increase in some of the oil-producing countries, it is probably will not be enough to meet the shortfall coming from Russia. If
Hmm.
all of the Russian oil is boycotted and embargoed, then there will be an increase. But if some countries continue buying oil from Russia and then probably re-exporting it, then it will be the price increase will not be as big.
On that point of sentiment, Russia may be turning to China for military assistance. If it is answered in the positive, what do you think the implications could be on a global expectations for the global economy?
I think that there will be a lot of sanctions to China because I think that Europe and the United States today feel that they really don't have any control over what is happening in Ukraine. They feel that Putin has the upper hand and he does whatever he wants to do, and they realize that actually what is going on is quite dangerous. How far this can expand and how far Putin can go, and again, Putin has been very clever in testing different things over the past, I don't know, 10 years, 12 years, trying to get further and further out west. And again, we can view this war in Ukraine as as the ultimate goal of Putin, but also we can view it as testing for something that can come up next. So understanding that this is not the end, that this might not be the end, if the West and the U.S. and Western Europe allow China then to start supporting Russia, they realize that then there is a big bloc forming against Western values, democracy, Western market economies, and so on. And they'll have to act I think, very strongly in order to stop this and cut it. So I anticipate sanctions, trade wars, disputes, and all kinds of unpleasant things like that.
Just still on this point of China, are there worries that China's banks and institutions may allow Russia to circumvent sanctions? But at the same time, China is a smaller trading partner with Russia than the US. Is it well placed to be a moderator in this conflict?
I I don't know. I think that actually the cost to China could be quite significant, and the upside is not very clear. I mean, I think that you're right that if you look at the trading partners of China, the West, the US, even here, Southeast Asia, much more important than Russia. If they side with Russia, they may cut, a big chunk of their trade, and if they circumvent also the financial restrictions and allow financials to flow through China, that can generate other restrictions and other bans that will not be so pleasant. So I really don't see the upside for China. And when you look between, Putin and Xi Jinping, Putin reacts. I mean, he's a very cold-minded person, but also he reacts. He plays on the emotions of people, and there is a bit of an emotional reaction there, and there is a willingness just to to get Russia to its former glory. If you look at Xi Jinping, I think the Chinese government is much more rational, and they see what is good for China, what is good for the people, for the economic development of China. And if you look at it rationally, it's just difficult to see the benefits of siding with Russia.
If we look at Southeast Asia and the fallout of this conflict on this region, how do you think rising commodity prices, wheat, soybean, for example, how could rising commodity prices impact the growth outlook here in Asia?
So in general, commodity prices usually generate downturn, at least for some time, temporary, because it's, as we call it, it's a supply shock. There is definitely also a second shock that is coming, which is the food prices, and I think it will come a little bit slower than the commodities prices, but it will be pretty big, because we know that Russia and Ukraine are some of the biggest producers of grains and fertilizers and everything related to food. I mean, I think somebody published that 12% of the calories are exported by Russia. I mean, it's like,
Yeah, I read that.
yeah. So this is this is obviously worrisome, because it is not so much even about the economic downturn, but it's about nutrition and hunger and people having food. Now,
Hmm.
Asia in general, Southeast Asia, here we consume more rice rather than the wheat and corn and so on. But still, with all these other parts of the like the fertilizers, I think it will have a, obviously difficulty. But again, the commodities per se, they will generate definitely a shock, both a price shock, but also the supply chain shock that will lead to lower production incomes and possibly a recession.
So, food security is certainly an area of concern here in Southeast Asia. Professor, can you share with us perhaps your thoughts on the most significant dimensions of the fallout arising from the Ukraine crisis?
Well, I think that there are already several outcomes. So, I mean, again, looking at Europe, uh, Germany is militarizing. That's something that is a big change, tripling their defense budget, buying planes and everything. So I think that Europe will have to review their defense policy, and they're reviewing their defense policy against Russia. I think that in the peace, the world order that we had from the end of the Cold War until now is gone. I think that there will be increase in defense spending, and I don't know. I hope that there won't be any more conflicts, but I will not exclude that. It depends on how the Ukraine crisis ends, because there are many different scenarios. Then we can talk about very different possible world orders. I mean, the extreme, the most unpleasant one is obviously that there is a nuclear war. Many people dismiss this. I'm not
Hmm.
so fast to dismiss that, because, again, Putin is not predictable, and he's determined to show that he won. And if the West somehow puts pressure on him, he might resort to extreme measures. By the way, it's actually interesting. Russian rulers have always been willing to sacrifice a big chunk of their country population just to win at the end of the day, or just to to go for a win, even if the cost is extreme. So in 1812, Napoleon was marching towards Moscow, and they had this battle against the Russians that the Russians lost near Borodino, and then they went to Moscow, the French. The Russians evacuated, they moved out, and they burned down the entire city to the ground. I mean, it's that was their most beautiful city and so on. But they were willing to make huge sacrifices just to to get to their end. So I don't know what they're ready to do now, but I know that Putin will not surrender or will not be captured like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. And I think that this is very important, because what is missing today from many discussions is the role of Russians in all this. And Russians are stigmatized, the ordinary Russians, but I do not see change in Russia without Russians. I do not see the West liberating Russia. I see that, and again, my history, my personal story is that I lived in Bulgaria until 1990 for 24 years. And when I reflect back on what happened in Eastern Europe, the West did not liberate Eastern Europe. The West did not come and conquer Berlin or Sofia or Bucharest. What happened is that people changed. But people changed because we were listening to Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, because Western organizations were engaging with people there who believed in Western values and wanted change. And that's what we need to support now, the Russians who will make the change in Russia. We have to figure out how to do that instead of stigmatizing them and saying that every Russian is pro-Putin. In fact, there are probably more Russians who are against Putin than in many other countries. So it's I think that this is very important, because when we think about post-Ukraine world order, where Russia stands and where it is with Putin or with another autocrat, or whether it is with the more democratic government, makes a huge difference.
Well, thank you as always for your enlightening thoughts. Professor Ilian Mihov, Dean of INSEAD, joining us here on Influence.